You come to order. Today is Tuesday, September 13th, 2016. This is a study session for the Prescott City Council. Roll call, please.
Mayor Oberg. Here. Mayor Pro Tem Emerson.
Here.
Councilman Blair.
Here.
Councilman Lozelle.
Here.
Councilwoman Orr.
Here.
Councilman Shiska.
Here.
Councilwoman Wilcox.
Here.
All present.
Item A, please.
Item A, discussion of draft ordinance for regulation of structured sober living homes.
Is it on? Okay. Good morning, or afternoon, whatever, Mayor and Council. Today we're going to go through the substantive provisions of the Structured Sober Living Ordinance, and I did distribute through Dana you all yesterday copies of the draft document. It's obviously not in the form of an ordinance. It doesn't have the heading and the whereas clause and those things. Because today I kind of just want to focus on the actual regulatory provisions, and for purposes of the audience and maybe TV, I'm going to speak from here and go over the pages that I gave you yesterday. Okay, the first thing, though, I want to talk a little bit about is our current definition in our Land Development Code of a community residence. One of the issues that Council brought up was this issue of feeding or lack of feeding of residents in our group homes. And so rather than make that a sort of performance measure in this Structured Sober Living Home Ordinance, we simply propose to change the definition of community residence in the Land Development Code to include some type of, and this is kind of rough language working with community development on it, but it's hard to see, but the activities must include one or more communal meals each day. In other words, in order to meet the definition of community residence and be allowed as a use in either multifamily or single family zoning, one of the activities that they have to do is provide meals. Now we'll refine that language before we bring it forward, but that's kind of the idea to deal with it, rather than making it a performance type measure in the ordinance we're talking about that's going to go into not into the Land Development Code, but into the to Article 6 of the City Code. Just so kind of for background purposes as well, in brief, community residence group home is 5 to 12 persons. The number of persons actually allowed to live there is based on the number of bedrooms and size of the bedrooms and those kinds of things, which are set forth in our building code. We have two kinds of community residences, transitional and family. A family community residence is what you would think of in terms of a sort of traditional or typical group home for the disabled. There is an indefinite length of time where one lives there. Group homes for the developmentally disabled, for instance, would fall into that family community residence. Those are allowed as a matter of right in single-family residential zones. And the reason is that because that type of length of time emulates a traditional or biological family. That's why that use is allowed in single-family residential zones. Transitional community residence, the length of time is measured in months rather than years. That's more typical of what we're talking about here, sober living homes. 3, 6, 9 months, maybe a year. Transitional group homes or community residences are allowed as a matter of right in multifamily zoning districts, not single family, because it more emulates the type of family or type of life that would be more consistent with a multifamily type zoning district. In other words, if you think of apartments, multifamily zoning, it's usually year to year, for instance, on a lease. Now, that doesn't mean people move out or change residences every year, but it's generally on a year-to-year type basis. So that's the rationale behind that. I just want to sort of give that by way of background. And also to point out, and again, this is really sort of for the public and everything, the limitations. The term community residence doesn't include in other words, it requires that the persons in a community residence are in a group home for the disabled. It also doesn't include residential facilities for prison parolees, sex offenders, those kinds of things. In other words, when we're talking about this, I know this has kind of been raised in the past, when we're talking about this structured sober living or group home sober living, it doesn't include homes for probationers, parolees, those kinds of things, or sex offenders. It's strictly limited to people in recovery, people who are in recovery and considered disabled under law. So, kind of going to go through this block by block. I'm not going to read this. Obviously, you've had a chance to read it. And certainly, if you have questions as we go, feel free. We've talked about this. What's the intent of this ordinance? The intent is to protect the resident or the client of the group home, of the sober living group home. And it's because those persons are considered disabled, and they are more vulnerable to being taken advantage of. Now, the purpose is to protect them from abuse, neglect, mistreatment, fraud, or inadequate supervision. So those residents or clients are then protected by way of this ordinance, and as a sort of secondary result or secondary benefit of better supervision and better care, the neighborhood around, the neighbors and the neighborhood around that particular group home should see better behavior, less interference, less disorderly type conduct because of these regulations. So that's the intent. Definitions, this is pretty much out of the statute where this arises out of. The one change we made is to structured sober living home. I inserted the term community residence. So in other words, this ties into our zoning code. So a structured sober living home has to be a community residence for people in recovery and so on and so forth. The rest of it comes out of the statute. The original statute talked about any home, facility, building, so on and so forth. We changed it to community residence so it ties it together with our existing ordinance. And then it kind of goes on.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Okay. When you talk about structured sober living homes and you talk about not being applicable to sex offenders, etc., sometimes sex offenders are also alcoholics and drug addicts. They're not purely isolated. So what you're saying by nature of the ordinance that's being proposed here is that somebody who is also a sex offender in the city of Prescott cannot live in a structured living home.
Well, there's two issues here. The first is the definition that we have in our land development code currently. And there are residents or homes for registered sex offenders, but they aren't defined as community residences or group homes because it's not considered a disability. So there are homes, I don't know if there are here, but there are homes where they're almost like halfway houses for people who are registered sex offenders and they all live there. They may receive some sort of treatment, but they aren't considered a group home for the disabled, which would then have certain protections under the Fair Housing Act. This ordinance, as we'll get to it later on, does limit against level 2 and 3 sex offenders. So because level 2 and 3 sex offenders under Arizona law are considered an immediate or potential threat to the community. A level 1 sex offender is not. So if the person's a level 1 sex offender, registered sex offender, and is in recovery, they, under this draft, would be allowed to reside in one of these group homes. But if they're level 2 or 3, which is a higher, a more risk, and it's really a Department of Corrections, police department kind of analysis as to how they're graded level 1, 2, 3, and it's usually based on probation office and those kinds of things, or parole office. They do an evaluation and they'll designate level 1, 2, 3. Level 2s and 3s are considered a high risk to the community. So we want to prevent level 2s and 3s from living in sober living homes like this because they present not only a threat to the community but also present a threat to the other residents of the home. So the answer is if it's level 1, they would in theory be allowed. If it's level 2 or 3, they wouldn't be allowed. as part of the community residence. And we'll get to that's part of the performance measures we get to a little later on. The rest of the definition, the second and third paragraph, is pretty much straight out of the the last paragraph is straight out of the statute. We just mirror that, and then the structured sober living home emulates a biological family. That sort of also goes to some of the issues that that there is that they have to act like a family. In other words, if it's strictly a boarding house that doesn't have meals, that they're sort of independent living, it wouldn't fall within this definition. But it also wouldn't fall within our community residence definition. It'd essentially just be a boarding house, and boarding houses are regulated differently in our zoning code. Okay. So the regulation starts out by requiring a license for structured sober living homes. And it prohibits operating a structured sober living home without a license. Now, when we talked about the land development code and the changes we made to that, we talked also about grandfathered uses or legal nonconforming uses. That's a function of land use law. And so we can't retroactively apply changes to the land development code or the zoning code to existing uses. That's why we had, that's why there are a lot of discussion about grandfathered uses. This is not a land use, this is not a zoning code or land use regulation. This is basically an operational regulation, a business regulation. So this applies whether the sober living home exists currently or any new ones that come in after the ordinance takes effect. So it requires a license. It gives a time frame. The draft gives a time frame within which we want to require the application to be made. So 60 days after the effective date of the ordinance, we're proposing an effective date of January 1, which would then coincide with our business license effective date, because that's going to essentially help us make sure that the homes don't fall through the cracks. We'll be able to vet by way of business license that they have to have this operational license.
Well, here again, I'm not trying to be devil's advocate here, John. What happens if you've got somebody who wants to rent their home to 4 or more drug addicts, recovering drug addicts, alcoholics, whatever, that are 2 or 3 sex offenders? I mean, is this applicable, or are they above and beyond this rule?
Let me say this, that let me go back a little bit. There are 2 types of sort of sober living group homes. One is called the Florida model, which is what we have here in town. And the Florida model is basically a structured sober living home. It's oftentimes they have a relationship, or they're tied to a licensed facility, a licensed treatment facility, and this is sort of one of the steps of the process that the licensed facility has, is they're put into a structured living environment, and that's what's being regulated by this ordinance. There's another model called the Oxford House model, and the Oxford House model is simply a group of recovering addicts or alcoholics who choose to live together in a clean and sober environment. It's not structured. It's just basically 6 or 7 or 8 roommates, and they're all there to sort of support each other through that recovery process. That is not regulated by this because it doesn't fall within the definition of structured. It is simply group, and that's a lot harder to regulate because of case law and Fair Housing Act, because it's not structured. So we aren't regulating those. Those are sort of just essentially roommates, although because they're all rooming together with a similar disability, they have extra Fair Housing Act protection against discrimination as well. But we aren't regulating those because there is no structure to them. They're simply people living together voluntarily and choosing a certain way of living, but there's no supervisor, there's no house manager, there's no operator. It's just 6 or 8 people or however many who choose to live, unrelated people who choose to live together, who happen to all have the same disability. Okay. So within 60 days of January 1st, we're requiring that this would require that license applications are submitted. Within 180 days of the effective date, we would require all of the operational requirements to be put into effect. And this obviously would be for existing operations. So we give people time to sort of get it all together and start complying. That also allows staff to not have 100 applications all come in on day 3. In other words, it kind of stretches them out because it is, as we've talked about before, there is going to be this sort of pressure on staffing to review all these applications. There's a lot of information that's going to be submitted. So as they come in sort of staggered, it allows us to actually sort of somewhat timely review those multi-departmentally and go through those, make sure that they have all the information, that it's all accurate. If there's any background checks that that have to be submitted, there's a lot that has to be done. So that time frame, both I think is a benefit to not only to the applicants or to the licensees, but also to the staff, that it won't sort of have this spike in getting 30, 40, 50 that have to be then turned around within a certain time frame. There is an option in here, and again, this kind of goes to the reasonable accommodation issue, to give an extra 180 days if there's something that they can't do by way of a lease. In other words, there may be some certain issues that would violate the lease therein. So there is an option to get an extra 180 days to fully comply, but on specific things that aren't doable, for instance, by way of a lease or some other restriction. But that doesn't mean that the rest of the ordinance doesn't have to be complied with. It's just sort of particular things, and it's sort of an administrative process. And then all along when we talk about the specifics of this, we always have to keep in mind this reasonable accommodation concept. We have and this, I didn't include it's a fairly detailed section that'll go into the ordinance about the reasonable accommodation process. I didn't include that here because it's kind of standardized, but it's detailed. So I didn't feel we really wanted to go through that today. But at any given time, an applicant or licensee can come in and ask for reasonable accommodation. And we're obligated to provide a process and an analysis whether or not to grant that reasonable accommodation under both Fair Housing Act as well as Americans with Disabilities Act. So that process is always sort of overarching this, which means if we put in numbers or if we put in specific things that have to be done, it's not cast in stone. There is flexibility to this under that reasonable accommodation requirement.
Can you give us an example of what strict requirement might result in a reasonable accommodation?
Well, for instance, probably the most relevant one really isn't here. It would be in our zoning code when we talk about a 5 to 12 limit. Reasonable accommodation, more often than not, will deal with the number of people allowed either per bedroom or in a house overall. So whether it's even financial, under these analyses, even financial considerations can raise a reasonable accommodation issue. So for instance, if an operator comes in and says, I need 8 people to make this group home financially viable, and the hard limit is 7 or 6, we have to go through that analysis to determine whether or not that's a reasonable accommodation that can be granted. Maybe if they ask for 8, maybe we give them 7, or maybe we give them 8. Maybe we say no because, but you have to go through that before you just say no. So that's kind of the most common one, I would suggest. Another one might be, and again, under the zoning code, our separation requirement of 800 feet. Somebody comes in and says, I'm 700 feet from an existing operation, but for all these reasons, I'd like a reasonable accommodation. I'd like 100 feet cut off of that buffer requirement. And we look at it and say, well, there's actually a hill or a river or something between the two homes. You go through that analysis and the staff analysis and grant the reasonable accommodation. in some of these, it's, quite honestly, it's, when the application process, the license application process, there's probably not a lot, but certainly, there's no sort of limit to what people can request on a reasonable accommodation. But again, it has to be reasonable, and they have to go through this process we have before, and then we do an analysis and make that determination. So again, without going through the, line by line, the license application requires 21 items. Everything from name and address of the home, driver's license information, copy of the lease if the property's leased, that clearly states that the use as a structured sober living home is allowed by the lease. We've seen problems in the past where an operator will lease a home and as his primary residence. And then it turns out that home is actually being used as a sober living home. And the absentee landlord from out of state doesn't even realize that until it comes back, that somebody contacts that person. So again, we're asking, and when we ask for, 1 through 5 is sort of some of the structural information you see, contact information, identification, house manager information, telephone numbers, a copy of the lease, and then we start getting into kind of like driving a boat, it's backwards. Okay, copies of what their supervision requirements are going to be. In other words, copies of their operating manuals and their house rules and those kinds of things. So we can make sure that they have those. Later on, I'll get to what has to be in those house rules and operating requirements. We state you have to address these issues. In a lot of the ordinance, we don't tell them how to do it. We just say you have to accomplish it because a sort of one size fits all draconian kind of regulation just is. One, it won't work, and two, it's impossible to enforce. So a lot of the pressure or obligation is going to be on the operator to come up with the solutions to the issues. We just say you have to do this, and they have to, of course, be reasonable within, and we'll get into that a little later. So again, supervision requirements, operation plan, rules and regulations. A statement that the only residents are persons with a disability, in this case in recovery. Copies of the forms that residents fill out, those kinds of things. One of them we have in here is in number 11. I think is critical, and this was done after discussion with our police chief. Is an agreement by the operator that if there is probable cause to believe that a violation of this code exists, that our officer is allowed into the common area of the property, the yard, side yard, backyard, main living area of the house inside, to ascertain whether or not there is in fact a violation. It doesn't allow the officer to go into the bedrooms, sort of the private areas of the home, but it does allow the officer to go in without having to get a warrant, and that would include sort of code enforcement as well. So it's basically knock, you have a neighbor complaint saying this is going on, officers regularly determine whether probable cause exists. I think they have that training and experience to do that. And this is a sort of pre-agreed to consent. And this allows for sort of on-the-spot enforcement of things going on. Now, does that require the officer to go in? That's going to be sort of a tactical operational decision. There may be times where the officers, the police department decides to back away and do something differently. But this would allow, again, code enforcement or police officers to go in, again, not into the bedrooms or private areas, but into sort of the common area, if you will, of the house. We also require, these things, smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, fire extinguishers. So all of these sort of safety issues to make sure that the house is appropriately and properly run in a safe manner. And then, of course, a fee. has to be paid. That fee hasn't been determined yet. We have to kind of, I think, sit down and decide. If the ordinance, let's say, is adopted with an effective date of January 1, I think we'll have to do some sort of financial analysis of what it's going to cost to review these packets and try and make some cost recovery analysis as to what the fee should be. And we can bring that back to the council by way of a resolution, similar to what we did with the business license. But we haven't gotten that far yet with sort of the analysis of what the fee for this should be. Then, once the application's in and reviewed, the license is issued in what we call an administrative or ministerial matter. In other words, if you meet the minimum qualifications of these 21 requirements, we issue the license. It's not discretionary. It's not like a conditional use permit that the zoning, like in zoning or something like that. It's a ministerial or administrative action that's issued. It's almost, I guess the analysis would, or the analogy would be like a building permit. If you meet all of the building code requirements for whatever you're building, we got to issue the permit. It's not discretionary. Okay. Then then we lay out the bases for potential denial or revocation, and if we determine at some point, either prior to issuance or after, that there's materially false information or misleading information in the application, we can rescind or deny. If we find at some point the owner or operator has an employment history where he or she was terminated for these reasons in the last 5 years, or has an employment history for physical assault, sexual harassment, embezzlement, theft, falsifying a drug test, or selling or furnishing illegal drugs or alcohol, we can deny or revoke the license. Number 3 is based on that item before, the agreement, the pre-agreement that our police officers, code enforcement are allowed into the common areas of the property based on if there's a probable cause. Denial could lead to a rescission or revocation of the permit. Again, there's a due process to any kind of revocation, but it becomes sort of a discretionary type move. I mean, it's not. We don't want to necessarily apply this in this sort of draconian way. We're going to try and obviously apply it in a reasonable manner. And then we look at backgrounds of criminal convictions, 7 to 10 years, whether sex offenses, violent crimes, arsons, bodily harm, sale or furnishing of controlled substances, those kinds of things. Again, those are the types of relatively recent criminal acts that we're saying are not conducive to the proper supervision of this type of population. So then there's further bases for revocation or denial. If the operator, and later on we'll get to the house manager issue, but if the operator has less than 2 years of sobriety, the owner operator, that doesn't meet the qualification. Because too often, I think our good operators, and I, by way of background, I've met since our last study session, I've met with a number of operators from town to talk about the various drafts, and we've been working on this. I've got a lot of input and feedback from a number of operators about this. And I haven't talked to all of them, obviously. I think I've talked to sort of enough of them to make a scientific extrapolation of 70% like this. But the operators I've talked to, all of whom are I think good solid operators, all have had input on this, and all of them pretty much tell me, yeah, we already do all of this stuff already. So it's not a lot of this ordinance is already being done. A lot of the regulations are already being done by our good operators. It's the ones that are questionable, the ones that maybe are in it just to make a buck, that we're going to try and raise that tide a little bit to bring them up to a quality performer. So
That brings me back to my question, John. Yes, we do have some very good operators in the city of Prescott that are there for all the right reasons. One of the reasons why I brought up the other deal, here again, not everybody's going to comply to what you're asking them to comply to because they don't want to. And I was in hopes that at some level, without denying equal opportunity to live in Prescott, without having the wrath of the federal fair housing and the ability of the Department of Justice to breathe down our neck, here again, certain things sort of run together. And what happens if we have homes that are outside of what we would consider compliant? They're not compliant with what we want them to be. They happen to be housing several sex offenders that don't meet our criteria, what we want them to be. And they also happen to be protected classes because they're alcoholics and drug addicts. Are we in a position to say you can't be here?
Well, again, if a person is deemed an imminent threat to the community, they don't get Fair Housing Act protection. So a level 2 or level 3 sex offender under state law is deemed to pose an imminent threat to the community. That's why they're classified level 2, level 3. Those people fall out of Fair Housing Act protection when it comes to housing.
Under state law, how about federal law?
That is under federal law. In other words, we classify
under
them as
federal
level
law,
2,
if
level
they're
3.
1 or a 2 or a 3.
Under federal Fair Housing Act, if a person poses a threat to the community, an immediate, imminent, or potential threat to the community, then they fall out of Fair Housing Act protection. If you look at level 2, level 3 sex offender designation or classification, it basically talks in those same terms. They pose an immediate, potential, or imminent threat to the community. So if you sort of meld those two concepts together, those persons fall outside of Fair Housing Act protections. In other words, we can't restrict, I'll give you a good example. We can't restrict a structured sober living home from being adjacent to a school, right? Because that would be a Fair Housing Act violation. However, we can restrict level 2, level 3 sex offenders from living within a half mile or whatever the state law is from a school. Does that discriminate against them in terms of housing? Sure it does. But there's a legitimate government interest that says that's okay to discriminate in that manner. So that's kind of the difference of those two classifications. So just because you have a disability, whether it's recovery or whether it's a developmental disability, but if you're also a level 2, level 3 sex offender, you lose those protections that you would have by way of the disability because you're also designated a potential threat to the community. So you've fallen out of the protection based on your bad acts. So that's how that kind of works. Did you have another question?
No, I'm
Okay, I was trying to remember if you had two questions or one.
I'm listening intently, trying to formulate exactly what you're saying, and I understand most of it.
Right. Okay, let me try it this way. If you have a disability, or if you're in any other protected class, race, creed, religion, ethnicity, you can't be discriminated against because of those things in housing. That would violate Fair Housing Act. Fair Housing Act protects certain protected classes from discrimination in housing, whether it's ethnicity, race, or disability. None of those people are entitled to Fair Housing Act protection if they are convicted of a sex offense and then are designated a level 2 or level 3 sex offender. They lose the Fair Housing Act protection because of the actions they chose to take. So it arises out of a conviction and then out of a subsequent designation as a level 2 or level 3 sex offender, you lose Fair Housing Act protection, and the federal law allows that. It's similar to if you're in recovery, if you're a recovering drug addict, and all of a sudden you relapse and you start using controlled substances. You lose that Fair Housing Act protection because of bad choice or whatever you want to call it, but the choice to then reuse or to not be in recovery anymore, you're no longer protected by the Fair Housing Act. So it's kind of similar to that. It's a designation. So the federal law allows for discrimination against people, even if they have a disability or even if they belong to another protected class, if they're a designated sex offender, a registered sex offender.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, all of these sex offender notices that I get in the mail, that I have brought by almost on a weekly basis here in Prescott, many of them are number 2, seems to be. Every now and then you get a number 3. That we're being told by the probation department, if they happen to be a drug offender or an alcoholic or something, we can't discriminate against them on that basis, but with what they're putting him, 2-3 miles from the front door on a daily basis, they can be discriminated against.
Yeah, you can. Essentially, a registered sex offender can be restricted as to where he or she lives, and the federal law supports that.
Thank you for saying it publicly.
Okay. So a couple of other issues, and this is really more. This is where we get to the kind of the performance measures and the enforcement. 2, 3, and 4 under this revocation. This is primarily going to be a revocation issue, where if the owner-operator fails to take immediate measures to remove or isolate a resident from contact with other sober residents, if the resident relapses or fails to actively participate in a recovery program. I'll get to this a little later in terms of the sort of streeting, curbing issue, but the idea here is that if one of the residents relapses, the rule is, and frankly the practice is you isolate that person from the other residents so it doesn't sort of catch on, for lack of a better term. So that's going to be a requirement. Another revocation standard is for significant or repeated violation of this particular ordinance. The other one is, and this is where we incorporate the house rules and the operating rules that the operator comes up with. If they violate their own rules on a repeated level or significant level, this Section 4 incorporates their rules and regulations and operating standards into the ordinance. So violations of their own rules can result in a revocation. So we've got sort of layers of enforcement ability here. And this last one is kind of important because most of the regulations are going to be their own rules and regulations and performance standards. So what are our standards that we are imposing? Again, we require that copy of the lease that clearly states that the home is intended to be used for a structured sober living home if it's leased. Obviously, like all other properties in the city, has to be maintained in compliance with all building codes, city code, land development code. This is where we prohibit level 2 or level 3 sex offenders who are considered intermediate to high risk are not permitted. And again, going back to that discussion we had, those are people that are essentially allowed to be discriminated against under the Fair Housing Act. Requirement 4 kind of speaks for itself. This is where we talk about the quality of the home, clean, safe, substance-free living environment. There's case management that's provided. One staff member is available on the premises at all times, and we'll get into the house manager issue a little bit later. And the owner-operator is available on call at all times. So there's going to be a house manager. There's going to be 2 people that we'll be able to contact as needed. Number 5, Narcan is basically if there's an opiate or narcotics overdose, Narcan will basically stop that from resulting in further damage or death. And again, in fact, all the operators I've talked to either already do this or intend to do it anyway. And so this is a good way to prevent if somebody does relapse, to have taken immediate action, and it's basically like an EpiPen to the thigh. So it's relatively simple to use. This is 6 is your staffing requirement. So your structured sober living home shall provide qualified staff, house managers, and others who understand these issues. And then number 8 is an insurance requirement, and this is really sort of both to protect the home, the residents, the client residents of the home, as well as any potential neighbors. So insurance requirement. Then we get to their own operating rules and regulations. So this is where we say you have to come up with operating rules and regulations that address these issues, and we have some minimum standards, I guess, for that the operating rules have to meet. Number 1 is basically, theft or borrowing issues. How are you going to address that amongst residents, between residents and staff? Weekly meetings, job seeking, and household chores, and adherence to house curfew. So we aren't saying you have to have a curfew that's from 8 a.m. to 8 or 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. We're saying is we want you to have a curfew. You determine what's best operationally for your curfew. If your residents continue to violate that curfew, and of course, it's going, if it's a midnight to 1 a.m. curfew, that's probably going to get rejected as not realistic or legitimate.
It's not a curfew.
It's not a curfew. But again, we're trying to sort of avoid this one-size-fits-all set of regulations because, like I said, they don't really work, and they're almost impossible to enforce from the city's perspective. Number 2 talks to the house manager issue. It provides basically a requirement of a 24-hour awake house manager, but some options, some alternatives, because there are some financial issues, where if the house manager is required to be awake, that means they have to basically work shifts. And there are some financial burdens that may be overly burdensome to the operator. And remember, as we talked about going through some of these other study sessions, we have to use the least, that's the word I'm thinking. Restrictive means possible to achieve our legitimate government interest. So by providing these options, whether there are some type of alarm system, some type of monitoring system, bed checks, motion cameras, something that would, if the house manager is asleep, would notify that house manager that one of the residents is attempting to exit the house during the curfew period, that the proposal is that should be sufficient to meet those needs. And again, we talked about, the ability for us to enforce an awake staff 24 hours is just impossible. We don't have, it's not like it's a licensed facility like a hospital where Department of Health Services can come in and do a nighttime inspection. We just don't have that. We don't have that ability, nor do we have the staffing to do it. So I think this is a good solution to that concern about whether the house manager needs to be awake or not.
So, Mr. Mayor, may I ask a question? So, John, you're saying that we cannot require 24/7 supervision?
No, it's 24/7 supervision,
Okay.
but the difference is
How they
it's either an
supervise.
awake staff during the night or some other means that achieves the same thing. Alarm, you can do an alarm system internally. So in other words, when somebody leaves the house, the alarm can go off. Or door opens and the alarm goes off.
Sure.
It's fairly inexpensive, and it should wake the person up. Or bed checks. In other words, the house manager does bed checks three times during the night, randomly, different times, those kinds of things.
So 24/7, someone awake watching is too restricted.
It is. And again, it's
Legally, you're saying.
it's too restrictive legally, and it's practically impossible to enforce. We're not going to know that. We'll never know. Now, how we'll find out, or how we may find out that the house manager isn't providing proper supervision
24/7.
is that if we find if some of the residents or clients of the house are out during the curfew and something happens, whether it's drug use, drug overdose arrest, or something else happens, that gets traced back to the house. They violated this requirement, and the license could be revoked. So there is a sort of hammer on the end if there is a bad or negative activity or result that comes out of it. I think again, we can say that this is our preferred standard, 24/7 awake. But in the alternative, here are some less restrictive means to achieve really the same thing, which is to enforce the curfew of the house.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. To Billy's point, so if we choose the less restrictive means as a measure to try and help the circumstance, and we choose to have alarms, does that trigger down the alarm ordinance to where you got to register
These
the
are
alarm
not.
too?
These are internal alarms of people exiting. So, no.
I have a friend of mine that has a little beep that happens throughout the house if they open a certain door.
Yeah. And it's loud enough, generally speaking, to notify the house manager that a door or window's been opened. So again, the point of all this, or the whole intent of all this, is to provide proper and adequate supervision for a vulnerable population, that is, people who are in probably their first year, maybe their first 6 months of recovery. And this is not in any way a pejorative, but those people make really bad decisions. That's how they got there in the first place. There are physical and sort of inherited attributes about addiction. Without going into that, is that decision making isn't one of their strong points. So, and by making, if somebody is trying to get out of the house to prevent a relapse, and we have a trying to relapse essentially, and we have a way to stop them from exiting the house, then we've accomplished the goal of proper and adequate supervision. And that's the whole purpose of this this section of the regulation. Okay. We also require that all persons in the house, other than the house manager, now that doesn't mean that the house manager may or may not be in recovery, but all persons have to actively participate in some type of recovery, structured recovery program. And again, under the rules and regulations of the house, refusal to actively participate may be cause for discharge from the house. This number 4 also kind of goes to the meal issue. Have access to meals, three meals a day at the home, whether they dine individually or as a group. So again, if you take the land development code change in this, the intent is to address that sort of overburdening of the soup kitchen, I guess is an antiquated term, but to overburden our local social service food providers that we've heard anecdotally tend to get overburdened by a van pulling up and dumping 6 or 8 people off.
Well, doesn't the term have access to 3 meals a day?
At the home.
At the home?
At the home.
Okay, that doesn't include going out to the local food kitchen
Right,
and
at the
having a
home.
meal?
So it could include an allowance
Okay.
where the residents go to the grocery store and acquire the food. Doesn't mean they have to have a cook in the home. Doesn't necessarily mean they have to dine together communally. But the concept is 3 meals a day at the home.
Okay.
If that means takeout or delivery, it doesn't restrict the residents from going out to dinner or whatever. In other words, they're not forced to eat, but this is access to that. Because I think that again is intended to deal not affecting the residents' or clients' choices of where they choose to eat at any given time, but it's intended to affect the operator who doesn't provide that kind of service. Which again, if the whole idea for Fair Housing Act protection is to emulate a family, generally speaking, if you're going to rely on the social service food providers, it's going to fall out of that sort of emulation of a family. Smoke-free, This is still sort of a work in progress. I think the standard line here is trading one addiction for another. I mean, and again, this is not in any way, I'm not trying to demean anybody, but this is exactly what happens is often most of the people in recovery, many of the people in recovery choose one addiction over another or trade one addiction for another, and so they become smokers if they weren't already smokers already. So this allows for non-smoking in the house. Again, as far as care and supervision of that disabled resident, it also requires a designation outside of a smoking area that minimizes or mitigates secondhand smoke to neighboring properties. So, and I know that's been kind of a regular ongoing complaint by neighbors, where there's a group of, say, 6 or 7 who might be standing out, and secondhand smoke becomes not just a distraction, but a health issue for people who maybe have asthma or other kind of breathing issues. So this is going to take some massaging language-wise to get it kind of final form. And I again, one of the inside the house no smoking rule is, I think, pretty much across the board, the people I've talked to already have that rule in place. So it's nothing new that's going to be imposed. The locking out of the residence is, again, I think that some of the folks you've heard come here talk before, it's not as if they're sort of kicking people out of the house. It's really more, there's a purpose, I think, to it, oftentimes to, at whatever point that resident is ready or should be ready to go do something kind of productive with his or her day by finding a job or doing volunteering, there's a sort of reason for this locking out issue, but we want to restrict that to only for legitimate purpose. In other words, if you're going to lock someone out of the house, it really needs to be for work or engage in some other activity, and to prevent the residents from having to sort of loiter about the front yard, being literally locked out of the facility. Obviously, number 7 is kind of pretty straightforward in terms of preventing use of alcohol or drugs. Number 8 talks about an operational plan, and this is the part that deals with this streeting or curbing issue, that the relapse and discharge policy must include options for eviction of a resident to avoid forcibly evicting a resident onto the street with no alternative living arrangements. So we provide some options, but again, it may be more creative or more practical solutions to this, but 3 options we provided is notice to family that the person's being evicted, and a lot of the operators currently do that. They're required to, by their own rules, required to call a family member before evicting someone, so that whether it's travel or financial arrangements can be made. Limiting the time of the day during which someone can be evicted. So in other words, not allowing an eviction to occur at 2 in the morning unless the person presents some sort of immediate threat to the other residents. So we go back to the isolation. A lot of the operators have multiple homes, and they're able to sort of separate if somebody relapses from the one home maybe to another home, or finding another operator who may be better equipped to handle this particular person. So because again, if an eviction occurs during the day, there's somewhat of a better chance that the person's going to be able to find an alternate place to stay rather than the middle of the night. And again, trying to make alternate living arrangements or referrals. So again, and then prohibiting the discharge without some sort of alternative living arrangement. The challenge here, of course, is that none of these folks we're talking about are there by way of a sort of a court order. If they are, then a violation of the house rules will result in some sort of revocation of their parole or probation, which generally would mean they would be arrested. So we're talking about people who have the freedom of travel and the freedom of choice, and if they choose simply to walk away from the house, there's not a lot that an operator can do to prevent that from happening. So that does this number 8, prevent somebody from walking away? It doesn't. What it does, again, it puts the burden on the operator to make sure that if they're going to evict someone for a relapse, that they use whatever means possible to try and prevent that person from simply living on the street.
So John, would you say number 8 is the exit strategy?
The exit strategy, that's our exit strategy provision, right? And there was a prior provision we talked about too that kind of dealt with exit strategy as well.
John, would it be, I don't know the right word. Let me just ask a question. Could we put in this rule that maybe they'd have to record these walkaways or evictions? Or is that under some protected of information like HEPA or something?
Mean like video record?
No, just for like our
Document?
code enforcement document that, so we can get statistical information of who's walking away.
Well,
Or not necessarily who, but
Yeah.
the numbers.
Yeah, I think if part of the supervision requirement, if the person walks away and poses a threat to himself, herself, or others, then they have an obligation to call law enforcement at that point. So if it's that situation where somebody relapses and they got high and then they walk away and they're not, and the operator or house manager says this person's probably poses a threat to himself or the public, then they have an obligation to call law enforcement to basically do a welfare check on that person.
And I get that, that's obviously public record then when that happens, when law enforcement responds. I guess what I'm saying is, if they have a track record of maybe half their community residents over a period of a year walk away or get kicked out or terminated in some sort of way, that maybe they're not the best house.
I see what you're getting at. Let me look into that in terms of some sort of maintaining some sort of record of whether it's relapses in terms of just statistics.
Right.
We see if there's a way we can possibly do that. And then as we kind of wind down on the house operating rules, obviously we're going to require, we want to see a written visitation policy and a good neighbor policy that deals with how, that lays out how the home is going to deal with issues that could affect neighbors. And so this is sort of the, this is one of those things where sort of addressing public complaints about sober living homes not being good neighbors. I will say that we don't really have, we've had complaints, but I don't think we have really data or statistics that show that sober living homes are any worse neighbor than anybody else. We just don't have the statistics on it. We've heard from Mike and code enforcement and PD, there have been issues. Code enforcement goes out, kind of addresses the issue and tends to resolve it. But this is one of those things where it's in there, and one of the reasons we can put this in is because of it's a little bit transient isn't the right word because that sort of implies some things, but it is transitional. There is a sort of there is a greater sort of rotation of people living in these homes, and so to have a good neighbor policy, and as I said before, the people I've talked to all have some form of good neighbor policy, and so we're just going to kind of want to formalize it a little bit to get some structure to it, to deal with some of the issues. And then requiring that the rules and regulations of the home be posted or visible or available to look at, so that everybody kind of knows what the expectation of the home is. So that's kind of the rules and regulations portion. The next is the house manager certification. We've talked about that in considerable detail, and this just sort of formalizes it. We're going to require that the house managers be certified, and then the minimum qualifications are these: high school or GED, 21 years of age, 1 year sobriety. I think it's this term sustained sobriety, and then some of the training. 4 and 5 deal with the training that we've talked about before. Now, and this is a good example, Councilman Wilcox, of what you said. Give me an example of where a reasonable accommodation will come in. If somebody has 9 months of sobriety, 10 months of sobriety, and an operator says, here's all the reason why this person should be allowed to be a house manager, that could be a reasonable accommodation issue. Allow somebody, or somebody who's 20 years, 6 months. Those are some of the things that you could come in for and ask for a reasonable accommodation to maybe get an exception to the hard rule. And then last.
So John, before we
Yes.
go to that point, the operator, it was 2 years sobriety, owner operator.
Right. House manager 1.
Yeah, I think that it seems like, this is the 24/7 person is the house.
But the
manager.
person ultimately responsible is the owner operator. So, and I think as a practical matter, I think 2 years of sobriety requirement is not going to work, because it's my impression that people become house managers after their first year of sobriety and say, I'm sick of this, I got to go back to the real world, and then they blow out. And so there's a high sort of rotation of house managers as well. It's not really a career path that people choose. They may graduate and do other, get more training and do other things like behavioral health type training or counselor type training, but house manager is kind of the low rung on the totem pole when it comes to this industry.
It just seems to me that 1 year is pretty short
But that's
for someone that's in charge of
right, but that's
4
also
to
based
15.
on sort of industry standard and some, medical data that says that 1 year, that first year is sort of the most stressful, kind of
Right.
tenuous year. But I don't think it's going to be much tougher to defend legally if we push it out beyond a year.
Okay.
So,
It just seems like that's maybe where some of the problems and the issues, it's the reason that we have tried to create this class course is to
right.
try to
Right.
help.
And-
Because
and,
I
you
just
know-
think that would be a very stressful
Yeah.
thing for a person 1 year out of sobriety. But
Well, I think that becomes kind of the turning point. Is my impression from the folks I've talked to, is that 1 year. And again, that's 1 year of sobriety. That's in that sort of, with that sort of disease. That's a long time. I mean, is it ideal? Is it the perfect answer? No, but I think it's the more defensible answer if we're going to do this. So I think if you push it out to 2 years, I don't think we're going to have it as defensible.
well, again, Greg brought up a point that hopefully there'll be data gathered, and then we can
They'll be do what?
data
Oh,
will be
yeah.
gathered so that we
Yeah.
can see whether or not.
Right. And again, the owner operator is going to be the real, the owner operator is going to have the pressure and burden to make sure they comply with the sort of overall ordinance. The house manager is just that. He or she is the manager of that particular residence. So,
Yeah, okay.
and then reasonable accommodation, I just put this in again. It's in a couple places, and then following on this, there's pages of the process. Last but not least is the reporting violation. We talked about this a little bit. This is sort of a whistleblower type provision in the code. Self-reporting, either by house managers or residents, is really going to be the way, in addition to, if there are issues with bad neighbor policy or bad neighbor activities, but this sort of self-reporting or by either residents or employees is really going to be the primary way or one of the primary ways we're going to be able to enforce this. If there's a constant rule breaking, if there's regular rule breaking, then an employee would be able to come to the city or go to the manager or the operator and say, that there's all these rules being broken, nobody's doing anything about it. And then if the manager doesn't do anything or owner operator doesn't do anything, come to the city. There is already a state law protection where if an employee reports a violation of law and that employee is fired, that creates a cause of action for a civil lawsuit. Those things, may or may not be the most that may not be the most effective way for whistleblower type protection. This would actually make it a violation of the code if somebody were fired or if a resident were evicted. And we've heard testimony in the committee that where if a resident complains of rules being broken or people relapsing, they're kicked out of the home. So this would be a potential violation if that were to occur, which could end up one of the enforcement issues is a revocation of a license. So that concludes my very brief presentation on this ordinance. I'm happy to answer any further questions or address any other issues.
Councilwoman Wilcox.
Let's go back to definitions. I think you've got a very comprehensive definition of structured sober living home. But I'm concerned about people living together as a group who are in recovery, who are loosely connected with some kind of program. But there are four or fewer living in a home in a single-family zone. And one enforcement officer knocks on the door and says, I understand that you're part of such and such a program, and they'll say, oh no, we're just four guys living together. It seems to me we could be still seeing a proliferation of unofficial sober living homes in the community, and this isn't going to cover all the gaps,
Right,
all
it's
the
not.
problems.
No, I mean, it is not. It doesn't cover 100% of the gaps. And if you go back to our community residence definition, remember it starts at 5. So we can't. It's very difficult to adopt a legally defensible zoning code for group homes or for unrelated people of four or fewer. We actually kind of pushed the envelope, and the HUD folks looked at it and they said, kind of, you push the envelope, but it's still legally defensible. Trying to restrict, 2, 3, 4 people, unrelated people living together, whether they have handicaps or not, is almost impossible from a legal defensibility standpoint. The other thing it won't do, as I mentioned before, is deal with that Oxford House model, which is basically 6 or 8 people, whatever the number is, who choose to live together in a clean and sober environment that's not structured. It's simply, they're effectively roommates, but because they all have a common disability, they have Fair Housing Act protection against discrimination. And this definition, other than the reference to community residence for people in recovery from drug or alcohol addiction and so on and so forth, that's right out of the statute. So we are kind of limited to that that definition. Revise it somewhat so it's more consistent with our zoning code rather than refer to just house, building, structure. We put in community residence. So we're really talking about specifically community residences, group homes, and in this case, for sober living. So it I don't want to say they're holes, but it sort of deals as narrowly as possible and in the least restrictive means possible with a particular problem or situation where the government, the city in this case, has a legitimate interest. And that's what we're required to do under Fair Housing Act and ADA, and Equal Protection Clause. It is the least restrictive means available to address a legitimate government interest.
Well, I think it's important for people to understand that this isn't going to solve every problem that we've heard about, every nuisance issue. We do have some other codes
Right.
that
We
we've
do.
already adopted.
I think, again, this is not sort of the cure-all, but we have a very solid land development code that addresses this issue. We have a disruptive property section in the code. We also have to deal with some of the grandfathered uses. We changed our legal nonconforming use period from a year to 6 months. After this, we'll talk a little bit about civil citations by code enforcement. Right now, our code enforcement officer, I don't want to get ahead of myself, can cite, into court for violations of the property maintenance code. Never could do that before. So we've adopted a lot of pieces and parts and tools to try and deal with the pretty complex issue. And so by doing it with these different parts and pieces and tools, we're better able to sort of focus on the particular problems rather than trying to have some just big omnibus type legislation that is so is Obamacare like? To not get political, sorry. I read this before. No, just kidding. So anyway, any other questions from the council at this point?
Yes.
Councilwoman Orr?
Yes, John, first, as I told you before the meeting, I think you've done a great job, and I appreciate it. And it's a lot of work that's gone into this. I appreciate having this yesterday and not today, so thank you for that. And I very much like the way that you structured the intent of what we're doing about protection for both, not only those in the house, but also those that live in the neighborhood. I do have some concern about the 1 year for the manager. I think that's
Right.
putting that person in a pretty stressful situation, but I understand the least restrictive. My question is on at what point if violation, until there's a revocation. So will there be a standard so that this is applied, fairly across?
Well, there'll be a process when you get the final ordinance that talks about the sort of the due process rights if there's a revocation action. Is it going to be? I think the process will be standardized. In other words, what's your notice and opportunity to be heard due process? Will the answers be the same every time? No. I mean, that's kind of the whole idea of due process is you have to take the specific set of facts and you have to then apply the law to those facts, and then a decision maker, if the operator who's sort of subject to the revocation wants to oppose the revocation, there'll be a sort of adjudication of that, and the decision will be what it is, you know. But the kind of the point is that, like any of our city code or state laws where we enforce or prosecute, there is prosecutorial and law enforcement discretion as to
Sure.
what's the intended outcome. I mean, so, you know, the challenge here, and I probably should have said this from the beginning, is we are the tip of the sword, hopefully not literally. I mean, nobody's done this. We're the first to do this. And I heard at one of the county meetings that pioneers get the arrows, you know, for whatever that means. They also get hills named after them, you know, so ooh. But anyway, but the point is that, you know, there is going to also be, by the way, kind of as part of the final ordinance, a 1 year kind of mandatory review by the council. Let's take a look at this ordinance, see if if we need to change things based on the actual operational outcomes of this being in place for a year. So we'll have it's not a sunset per se, but it is a mandatory relook to see what changes need to be made one way or the other, and see how whether it's working, what doesn't work, what needs to be changed, those kinds of things. So we're going to put that in as kind of a forced relook at it after a year to see how things are working.
Okay, because there do need to be consequences.
Right. Well, understood. And that's going to be a function a lot of you know, staffing and
Sure.
what the problems are, what the violations are. But I think that the operators I've spoken with and met, they're all real happy about this. And it sounds funny, but they want to raise the standard because they're, for the most part, already meeting or exceeding these standards. But they want the other folks to meet or exceed the standards.
Great.
So that's the goal here, is sort of raise the tide, as it were. But we'll take. I think it's a good idea to take a look in a year from now, maybe, or you know, a year from October, after this has been in place, assuming it takes effect in January, to say, hey, how are we doing on this?
So final question, the Oxford model, the unstructured, is there no owner-operator? So would that be one
Generally
definition?
speaking, there could be an owner of the house type thing. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, an owner who then provides for the residential component, but there's no structure. It's not tied to any kind of treatment facility. There aren't any sort of external rules. They make up their own kind of living arrangements, and they self-enforce. I don't think we have a lot of Oxford, if any, here. It's all what they call the
Kind
Florida
of like
model.
college kids living together.
In a sense, although these folks in a group home, remember, they all have a disability. So it's in Oxford House is actually, there's a case called Oxford House, which cities attempted to prevent group homes because they weren't sort of traditional group homes, because they weren't operated by someone. But the courts have said those Oxford houses have the same protections in Fair Housing Act, and so we aren't regulating those because they don't fall within the definition of structured sober living home under the statute.
Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. John, I appreciate your caution on the issue. Again, not being skeptical or not trying to be skeptical. There was probably a reason why no other municipality had a hotshot team either. So while we're moving forward, I think, being more cautious than not is a good plan.
Any other questions, comments from the council? Okay, I'll open it up to public. Any comments?
Mayor Bird, Council. My name is Peter Thomas. I reside in Prescott. I'm the Executive Director at Chapter 5 and also the President of NARA. I know that the 24-hour supervision, awake supervision, has been an area of contention both within the council and with the industry. I want to express my view that I think that that's really important. In Noel Campbell's first draft of the bill that passed, it was broken out into distinct levels of care, which allowed for certain levels to require 24-hour awake staff and others not to. In the absence of those distinct levels of care, any facility in town is able to admit clients who would meet medical necessity for residential treatment, like we provide at Chapter 5. And because of that, I think it's important that they be accountable for providing services that meet those needs. And beyond people sneaking out, I think a real concern is overdose and death in the houses. If somebody's asleep, a resident uses and they overdose, they could be dead for hours before they're discovered. And that's a pretty common story, and I think that needs to be taken into account. Chapter 5 is a licensed residential behavioral health facility, has both awake staff and door alarms, and people are still able to get out without us knowing immediately, and I think that should be looked at. There are a couple areas that I think are a little bit over-restrictive. With our licensure, we are not required to provide the names and contact information for our house managers. I think for owner-operators that makes a lot of sense, but for daily shift staff, why should they be reported to the city government? I wanted to address Councilwoman Orr's question about 1 year sobriety. I think that is industry standard. If you use medical terminology, at that point a client is considered to be in full sustained remission. Similar to somebody with cancer being in remission, it means that the disease is really at bay. So thanks for letting me make comments.
Thank you, Peter.
Before you run off, so let me see if I understand. If you have a client and operating a legitimate business in the city of Prescott, and that client has been disruptive or has left the facility, you don't think it's your responsibility to let law enforcement know who those folks are?
Thank you. That's a separate issue that I meant to mention up here. We have pretty detailed policies on how we deal with somebody walking off property. And there was a question about documenting discharges. I think it should be every provider's responsibility to make really detailed discharge summaries, whether it's an atypical discharge, somebody walking off, somebody completing, being referred to a higher level of care. That documentation is really important. As far as reporting to law enforcement, this may be shifting under new police leadership. Historically, we have not been able to get any police response when somebody walks off property unless they are actively trying to hurt themselves or someone else.
Well, I would think that was necessary when you start talking about people's lives, whether it be my own life or the person that has the drug addiction's life. So when that problem arises, I think it's beholding the person that's operating a legitimate business in this community to make law enforcement aware of that.
I would agree with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hello, my name is Bill Orick. I'm the program director for Triple Point Recovery Homes. I also have a contract with the probation department. And my concern, I have a few different concerns. I'll just go over them real quick. My main concern is the meals served, saying we're required to serve 3 meals a day. We would not be able to sustain if we're ordered to feed 3 meals a day. But with that said, whenever somebody comes in from jail or off the street or anything like that, we don't let them go hungry. My guys get together and they feed him, or we get him down to the local charities and get food boxes. But to have a requirement to serve 3 meals a day, that's a real big concern for me and other programs like mine. We don't offer any insurance, we don't take any insurance, we don't offer any treatment. We're just a basic structured sober living program with a contract with the probation department. You know, a lot of times my guys are ordered from the judge or from probation to come into my program. 99% of my guys are on probation. So, you know, that's a real concern with me is the meals. And then I also heard something about felonies for managers, 10 years without a felony. That's a real concern with us too. Because a lot of my managers have gone through my program. They've been on probation. They're doing good, and they stay on as a manager. But they do have felonies. You know, they're changing their lives, and I just think that's really discriminating against individuals trying to change their lives. But they do have, unfortunately, have gotten some felonies. And then where was it? Oh, and also, Mr. Palladini said something about a separation from a structured sober living program can't offer probationers services. I wasn't understanding that. Are you saying that we would be in a separate entity or a separate group if we're working with probationers? And the 24-hour staffing, but it does look like we're getting something worked out with that, with bed checks and everything, because we wouldn't be able to operate with 24-hour staffing. I try to keep my fees as low as possible for these individuals that I work with, so they can afford to be in a program and be required to do all the requirements from probation and everything like that. 24-hour staffing would really be detrimental to my program, but I do like that the bed checks and all that, which we already do anyways. A lot of this stuff we do and some. We carry high insurance because we do have the probation contract. I think our standards are high, and there's many other programs that are like mine that we keep our standards high. And I'm glad this is happening. Something had to happen in town here, but I just don't. I'm really concerned with some of the requirements that are coming down that may jeopardize some of us structured sober living programs. Where I don't feel we're in the same category as some of these other programs that do take insurance and they jump off of an IOP program. We're nothing like that. We're just a structured sober living program offering services for individuals that have struggled through their addiction. So I do believe that's it.
Yeah, one question from Councilman Blair.
John, regarding felony and that comment, maybe the wording should be drug-related felonies. I know there are felonies that are involved with manslaughter and other things where I think that if there is somebody legitimately, you know, trying to change their life, would there be a trial period, or would that be a definite?
Well, again, there are, you know, any of the sort of rules in the draft ordinance or in the ordinance are all there are reasonable accommodation type provisions. So, you know, when we have to set out, you know, in order to have an enforceable ordinance, you have to set out some standard. And you know, question for the council is, you know, this item says any owner, operator, or staff person. I mean, it's really up to you all if you want to just limit that to owners and operators, having a cleaner background than, say, a staff person like a house manager or something like that. I mean, that can be ratcheted out the time reduced.
If it were my business, they wouldn't. It would be upon the owner operator of the facility. They're the ones that employ the people. They're the ones that,
we can make that change. I think that
I think we're being pretty presumptive to have that go all the way down the line. I think that if this gentleman's standing here and he's got a legitimate court-ruled facility, and he's the one that stands to lose.
Well, again, regardless of the stand, let's say we just changed it to the owner-operator versus a staff person, or had a different standard for staff people, maybe fewer years since a conviction or a no contest plea to a particular list of felonies. We could ratchet the time back, but I think there is some point where you want to be cautious about these things. But they're all subject to a reasonable accommodation request. So if someone, let's say the standard's 5 years, but there's a staff person that the operator wants to hire that has 3 years, and come through a process, request a reasonable accommodation for this particular employee because he has 3 years and he's done all this stuff in the 3 years. He's less likely to be a recidivist in terms of a criminal or something like that. There are processes to get essentially exceptions to the rule for reasonable accommodation. So those are available, and we can certainly take a look at distinguishing between owner-operator sort of standards, which we do, for instance, on the sobriety, 2 years to be an owner-operator, 1 year to be a house manager, and looking at sort of the criminal background, maybe it's 7 to 10 years for the owner-operator, maybe it's 3 to 5 years for staff person, or something like that. We could certainly look at that and bring it back. So it's really up to you all.
So, and if I heard you right, even with the owner-operator, reasonable accommodations could be considered in certain individuals as well? Thank you. And the other one was high school GED or GED for the managers. I just really, it's a fine line between discrimination, because my client, the ones I work with, a lot of them have not gone through high school or get a GED. We motivate them to, but I've had managers before that have been awesome managers, but they don't have a GED or a high school diploma. Myself, I'm not going to give my full age, but I'm over 50, have not got a GED or high school diploma. And I'm pretty proud of the work I've done in recovery in our community. And for you to have that requirement on my managers, that's really difficult to understand. But, we still motivate individuals to go for their GED, but I just think that's a real fine line on being discriminating. So,
Okay, we have another question here from the Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Sort of going along with Councilman Blair's questions with regards to, I know when I go to get employees, there's certain things I'm not allowed to ask by standard, both federal and state. There's certain things I can ask and certain things I can't. And when we put together a proposed ordinance like this, very similar to qualifications for performance, there's certain things that I have the ability to ask and certain things that I don't without getting into trouble with either the federal government or the state government. And I would hope, here again, like I said earlier, caution with regards to some of the things. For example, OJT is a good thing. Having been brought up in a military background, not everybody that ever rose to the rank of something or other ever went to Harvard. Many of them didn't even finish high school. And yet, some of them have something as audacious as a Medal of Honor. Sometimes maybe we need to look at things a little differently when we do these things. So I'm just here again. We're not here to pass the ordinance today. We're here on a fact-finding tour, I guess. And I think maybe we need to take a look at how severe we want certain things,
And again, I think the biggest part of this whole deal that we're doing, is a mandatory one-day review or one-year review. It's often that the federal government or the state government passes laws, they don't work, but they're afraid to go back and change them because they're afraid to say they made a mistake, or afraid to say they were too lenient, or afraid to say they were too restrictive. So I think the best part of this whole thing is we are responding, and we will look at it again in a year and see if we need to loosen up or tighten things up. And I think that's what's best about all of us sitting here. We can do that for our community.
Well, and it certainly just the ordinance has a self, the self look at 1 year doesn't mean that it can't be looked at 6 months or less. In other words, the 1 year is just the outside time frame. As far as the mayor pro tem, employers, there's no prohibition for that would prohibit an employer from doing a criminal background check on a potential employee, no matter what. At this point, I mean, there's been some moves that some states have, some government.
But there's no requirement
There's no
that the state has imposed upon me as an employer to do it, and there are some things that I can ask
Right,
and
but
some
this,
things I
the
can't.
difference to some degree is this is a more regulated industry. That's kind of the desire of the legislature in adopting the statute, and presumably the desire of the city council to set some standards for operation of structured sober living homes. But in the end, it's all up to you as to where you want those standards to be. Where you want to ratchet it back, or you want to, get more strenuous on a regulation. The actually more difficult part is actually doing more rigid or more strenuous regulations, because then that's becomes less and less legally defensible. To go more lenient, certainly it doesn't create that problem.
Well,
in terms of legal defensibility.
I wasn't indicating being lenient per se, but I do think that criminality is different than sometimes your level of education or attainment of education, and I think that sometimes experience is different. Like I mentioned earlier with OJT and things like that, is different than somebody that came out of a 90-day School of Wonder program. So I'm just sharing it with you.
Councilman Lozelle.
Thank you, Mayor. Sir, I forgot your name. What was your name again?
Bill,
Bill, how long have you operated in town?
I was with Chapter 5 for almost 5 years, and we've started Triple Point in 2012, so I've been doing this. I have almost 11 years clean and sober. I've been doing it for about 10 years.
Okay. The reason I say that is, I've time and time again, over my history, I've taken, I've gone against my HR advice and hired somebody with a criminal background or limited education, taking the risk. The risk is mine, and if I was wrong, then I take the burden, just like you would.
Yes.
And 99% of the time, I was right by giving that individual a chance, and the chances, case by case, and all of them have paid off.
Thank you for that comment, too.
Bill?
Yeah, we got one more question here.
So, Bill, as I understand, I'm trying to find it, but I can't find it, where you have access to meals for three times a day, not that you need to provide 3 meals a day.
Okay,
Yeah. So,
thank you.
That's fine.
And again, we can, the two things are, if you want to make it 2, make it a little, again, more lenient, not that it's lenient, but, less restrictive, I guess. That's really kind of a policy call. But the whole idea is, in order to qualify as a group home for the disabled and to have those protections of the Fair Housing Act, you have to act and look, emulate like a family. And so if a home doesn't provide access or doesn't have any kind of meal, and it really is a boarding house, and a boarding house falls under a different zoning category. So the whole idea is that the house operation should look like what family, in quotes, looks like, and there is a, generally speaking, traditionally meals that the family participates in. So that's it's not just I mean, it's really two things. One, it's for, it's for care and supervision of the client, resident of the house, so that they aren't sort of on their own, for food. And the second is from a legal perspective, in order to emulate a family, there really needs to be a requirement for some type of meal preparation, planning, dining, whatever. And again, we try and not get into too many specifics about that, but that's what qualifies the home to be a group home, because it then emulates a family.
And I just have two quick may I make a suggestion on the food? What if our programs came up with a food policy? Like putting it in words where, like I said, our guys come together and feed that individual until he gets a job and is able to start paying for his own food, or that we take him down and get him his food boxes and all that. What if we just had that in our program policies?
I mean, that would be.
That's in your plan.
You would
Right.
review that during the planning.
Yeah. Good.
And then the last thing is, you said something about staff on property at all times. I have, my manager takes guys to work in the morning, takes them down to the grocery store. He goes to the grocery store. He's not there every 24 hours a day, and that is a concern for me. So
It's a 24/7 house manager requirement, but that doesn't mean that the person's confined to the house 24/7. In other words, there has to be a position or a duty position that says we have a house manager who is available 24/7, but obviously that person's not, under house arrest. So,
Because if he was taking everyone to the store, then he's obviously with them and he's nearby.
the wordage on that one section, it did say staff on property at all times. So we might want to change that. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else?
I'm Mark Temple. I'm with the Solution House and the Bridges Network. I was born and raised here, lived here all my life, got sober here in 1986, and last April I celebrated 30 years of continuous sobriety. I'm just throwing that out that it is possible. I've got a couple of questions for you. One, in your training of the managers in this course that they're setting up, we have already trained our managers in life coaching, CPR, and CPI. We allow absolutely no medication in our homes, not even vitamins, not even an aspirin. We have a licensed med department, and all that is conducted there. So my question is, would our managers who have already received this training be required to take this course?
well, this ordinance doesn't require a particular course. It just says training in these
Okay.
areas.
Okay.
So as long as there's some documentation of the training, that gets filed, that's fine. I mean, we aren't going to pick a particular course or instructor
Okay.
or form. So, if it's internal training, and it needs to be some type of documentation that this internal, whether it's provided by the operator or by by college or some private business that decides they want to do this kind of training. So we're not picking a particular course.
Okay.
I think that this course is available. It's a resource, but it's not it's not the mandated course.
Okay.
But I think whatever training they have has to meet at least the minimum requirements of the
Right,
course, right?
right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, what I'm asking is, you've got the assisted medication listed there, and we don't need that. I mean, would that be something that,
If they don't do it.
Well, I don't know if that's.
I mean, I'm prove we have
Well, yeah, I guess
the
again,
med
it's one of
room.
those alternatives. If someone is on some sort of one of the residents is on some sort of prescription medication regimen, then, and if it's not distributed, if it's not self-administered, then, and the operator administers it, then you have to have a license. You have to be licensed. And so if they're already licensed, and that's how they do their administration of prescriptions, and that would basically take the place of this training. If that's, so there's that, an exception can be created to that.
And then, go
Well,
ahead.
let me just ask you, so if you have somebody that requires maybe medication 3 times a day,
It's all done at our
you would have to
bedroom.
transport that person down to your IOP,
And that's what
and
we
then you
do.
would bring them back?
Yes,
All
sir.
right.
Just a suggestion on this bed checks. What we've been doing for a long time is we sporadically do it, it's different times during the night. And we have the manager text in that they did it. So we have proof that it was done. It's, we just don't rely upon, oh yeah, I did bed checks last night. And that may help you guys. I completely agree with the managers having at least a year's sobriety. The owners for 2 years. I mean, if I was making the rule, I'd like to see that longer, but that's not my business. One thing, in terms of when you're arriving at the number of residents that can be in a house, and you have the people with the disabilities, the addicts, the alcoholics, is the manager who does not live there, okay? He has his own address, his own place of residence. Is he included in that?
No, and that's really a building and safety code function, that number. So for persons with disabilities or for unrelated persons, shorthand, it's 2 persons per bedroom, but it depends on the size of the bedroom. If it's a 170 square foot bedroom, you can accommodate 3 people, and that's to avoid the overcrowding.
Sure.
And so safety, ingress, egress kind of issues. But no, the house manager it's a +1. So it's the residents are considered the residents of the group home, and if there's a house manager, even if he resides there, it's just a +1 to that.
We have some houses that we only have 4 residents in, and that's all we want there for specific reasons. The manager who does not live there, do they now force this into being necessary be part of this? Okay. Seems like there was something else I was going to ask you, but I can't remember it, so.
Okay,
Any questions? Thank you.
okay, thanks. Next?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Glenn Martin, Prescott. It's a question. I was looking at the house manager rules, and I didn't see drug testing on that. Is there drug testing for house managers or any routine for that? Thank you.
Currently in the ordinance, there is not that requirement, because well, the big question is how do we, enforce that and measure it? The house rules require that the house is drug-free and alcohol-free, and the residents are drug and alcohol-free, and the house manager is drug and alcohol-free, while in the house. So we aren't, my understanding is every operator out there is doing drug testing of all its residents on a fairly regular basis. I'm not sure. I have to look into whether or not we can mandate drug testing for house managers.
They put it on their plan, though.
They could put it on their plan as part of their operational plan. We could put in there, address this issue. Do you drug test or your house managers, and not necessarily require it. We could just get that as information, as I guess an option. I think it's the problem with mandating drug testing is generally speaking, the question is the position a safety-related position? You know, airline pilot, truck driver, that kind of thing. I'm not sure the house manager falls into that category where we could mandate it as a city. I mean, I'd have to look into it. I mean, there are certain, government can require that certain employees have regular drug testing, like for instance, to have a commercial driver's license or be an airline pilot or something like police department, military.
City councilman.
Yeah.
Well, we do.
Well, it seems like if we're saying they have to be sober for at least a minimum of a year.
Well, again, and not, I mean, that sort of assumes that all, and probably, it's probably a fairly good assumption that all house managers are in sobriety. Not necessarily all of them are. There are people, there are operators who are not addicts or former addicts. They have maybe relatives, spouses that have died from an addiction, so those kinds of things, and they've got into the industry. So I think a fairly high percentage of house managers are probably, you know, in recovery of some sort. Sure. But right, yeah, you know, so you have to have 1 year of recovery. If the house manager is in recovery and then relapses, they no longer meet that 1 year requirement anymore either. Right. So, you know.
How would you know, I guess, if you don't drug test?
Okay, any other questions? Any other questions? Okay. I think this has been a hard slog, getting to where we are today, getting the old Campbell's bill through, number one, and then looking at how we're going to progress on this. And I know you've done a lot of work working with research online with other states and what they're doing. And I can tell you, I was just at the League of Cities and Towns, and I had quite a number of mayors come up to me and say that, you know, they're waiting to see what we bring forth because they would like to take a look at and see if they incorporate it in their cities and towns. So, like you say, we're definitely pushing the spear here. Hope we don't stab ourselves with it, but we'll have to wait and see. So, I guess my next question is, where do you see us going from here?
Well, I'll take the sort of discussion today, comments, get them from Dana, and maybe make some proposed sort of changes or choices for changes. And I can bring a final version of the ordinance in 2 weeks. Whether you're ready to adopt at that point or you need more time to change. Again, if we adopt it in, say, October, the first meeting in October, you know, that still gives us plenty of time to put it in place or put it in effect with a January 1st effective date. We can also blame it on the new city manager too. Just kidding. So really, I mean, we can set it on the September 27 agenda with some maybe some of the draft potential changes to that, and you know, we can set it on the voting meeting, I guess. And then if you decide we need a little more time to sort of sand down some things, you know, it still gets us to the first meeting in October, which is again plenty of time to have this, you know, adopted, and it's over almost 60 or 45 days, whatever, 60 days before it becomes effective on January 1.
Okay. City Manager?
Yes, Mayor. Along the lines of what John said, and with the time being what it is today, perhaps what we should consider is shifting the second item on the agenda, the code enforcement, this meeting agenda, to the 27th study session, and also put the actual draft document of the ordinance for sober living, structured sober living homes, also on the 27th agenda for the study session. I think it's kind of a leap to not even have seen the ordinance and then put it on a voting session.
And then maybe John would just touch on the things that we've changed.
I'm going to go over the whole thing again.
Yeah. So that would mean on the 27th, what we would have is the draft ordinance for structured sober living homes, the draft ordinance authorizing code enforcement to cite for ordinance infractions, and the liquor license item that would be on the 27th.
Okay, and that would all be a study session?
Yeah.
Okay. And again, I appreciate everybody coming today.
Sorry, Mike.
We do definitely want to continue to hear from the public and from the operators. We want to make this the best ordinance we can and take into consideration all the issues that you may have. I also ask the council if they got any other thoughts on this in the next few days. Make sure you forward your thoughts to Mr. Palladini so he can look at whether or not we can incorporate them. So if there's nothing else, this meeting's adjourned. We'll start again at 3 o'clock.
Item C? Item C? Or did you get all your?
That one needs to-